Scripture, we're going to talk today about Africa, and this is part 2. We already looked at one section of Africa. Let's begin with Zambia. We finished with Kenya, Uganda. That was where we left it. Zambia. Vic and Wilma Eason were in Kenya, and Vic started feeling stirred that God wanted them to move on from Kenya. They actually, several times, were going to go to Nigeria, but each time they would get ready to go, civil unrest would break out. They would be rioting, and so they would delay. And so finally they decided to go to Lusaka, Zambia. We have a picture of when they were announced. This is in the tent. They were announced. That's Vic and Wilma. Wilma is in our church. Vic has gone on to be with the Lord. They were announced out of conference, arrived in Lusaka, Zambia, and Vic realized that he had left his Bible. He had forgotten to bring his Bible. He was, of course, never without a Bible, so they got a taxi to go find a Bible. And so one of the things I want you to understand, one of the miracles, and there are probably hundreds of stories like this, that in many places, when we send missionaries, they have to get a visa. You have to have a legal reason to be there. So this was true for Vic and Wilma. They were going there, but they did not have a visa. So Vic forgot his Bible. They get in a taxi to go look for one, and they saw a sign that said Biblica, books. And so pulled in there, and a man came out, and he explained he was looking for a Bible. And the man said, I will get you one. You come back tomorrow. And when they came back, he gave them a Bible. But the man that helped him, helped get him a Bible, was a man named John Chisha. And was already a Christian. I believe he was already pastoring, but was very, very helpful. Was able to help the Easons get a visa and help numbers of other workers in time to come in Zambia. The Easons spent 3 years in Zambia, and then they turned it over to Steve and Jeannie Bowman, who took over from them. Here is the conference that they were announced. The Easons were going to leave, and the plan was to go to Ivory Coast. The Bowmans were going to take the work in Zambia, and that is when Tom and Janice Payne, when they went to Kenya, they all went. They were announced on the same night. So Steve and Jeannie took over. We have a number of photos from that era in Zambia, and here they operated in a tent, and operating in a tent, then they began building a compound. There's a wall, that's where the guards lived, and various things, but it was located originally, it was a tent. And so the Bowmans spent a number of years there. We had numbers of missionaries from the United States. John and Molly Robinson, Larry and Debbie Elliott, Larry and Mona Mitchell, Barry and Dora Bales, Chuck and Arlene Hansen, Kevin and Joan Hanston were just some of those from the United States. Australia also sent a number of missionaries. We have some photos of these are early workers. Now we have African workers. Kevin Foley was there preaching. There are some of the Australian workers, some American missionaries, different ones that were laboring to build a work in Zambia. The Bowmans wound up turning the work over to Jeff and Maureen Day, and Jeff and Maureen Day wound up spending 12 and a half years there from that era. This photo is actually Jeff Day, Steve Bowman, and one of the African brothers there. And so the Days took over. Have some more photos from that era. This is George Carabasas, who wound up taking it over, doing a healing crusade. This was Jeff Day's task, was ultimately to train up workers to nationalize it. And so this is part of that process. And here then in time they built a building, and a great blessing, finally getting out of the tent after many years. That's the building that they built there. This is a conference. They began to plant churches. They began in the Bowman era, but the Days carried that on. And then ultimately Here on the stage there, that is the three different generations, Jeff Day, Steve Bowman, and George Karabassis. Here is a photo at conference. You can see the work that God is doing there. And then in the final photo, here is George and Irene Karabassis. They wound up taking over the leadership of all of the churches in Zambia. As of right now, 2023, December, we have 69 churches in Zambia. And they also have planted 13 other churches in 3 other countries, Malawi, the DRC, and in Angola. The next nation we're going to look at is Nigeria. The first church that was planted into Nigeria, one of the reasons I'm telling you stories, how do we get churches in these places? The first one came by a natural burden. Out of the church that is Walthamstow, Waltham Forest, they sent Fola and Mario Ediran. They went there because they were Nigerians, so they naturally had a burden for their home country, and they were the first ones that pioneered in Nigeria. But there's a lesson now we want to learn here, and that is that God uses negative circumstances to work His will. This is the amazing thing about God. Even when difficult or bad things happen, God can use that for His purposes. So now we have one work in Nigeria. The next 3 workers that went to Nigeria, they were all living in England. They were living in London, and they were all there illegally. They did not have visas to stay in the UK, and so they had gotten saved. They're now being discipled, but they're struggling because of a lack of paperwork, so they're not going to be able to stay. And so what do you have to do to fix that? In their case, their only option was they had to go back to Nigeria, and in order to resolve their immigration issues. And so this was true for 3 couples, Success and Penny Adeshida, Glenn and Kemi Botu, and Yomi and Kari Iketuyunu. All 3 of them went to Nigeria out of something negative. Think about it. It'd be like someone getting saved in our church, being discipled, feeling a call to ministry, but because of a legality, it's not possible for you to stay. That seems bad, but God turned it into good, because all 3 of them wound up pioneering churches in Lagos, Nigeria. We have some photos from the early days here. This is top left, that is Success, Adeshida. Here are outreaches that they are doing. This is in the city of Lagos. I think there's another photo here now in different ones. You see Pastor Mitchell would go there to help them and to preach. Labored. They had various pastors' seminars. I don't know if in those days they originally had conferences, but he began to invest in that. Have a next photo here. This is after the early days. On the right is Nigel and Carol Brown, who oversees, he is the pastor of Walthamstow, who was sending workers and investing and helping them. These are now some of the early couples that were laboring, and then they began to plant churches. And so they sent this, "Your legacy has raised us well," and that was in honor of Pastor Mitchell. His vision from Prescott to Perth, West Australia, who planted in Walthamstow, Walthamstow planted in Nigeria, and that legacy moved on. They began to plant churches. Ultimately, they wound up having a conference, and in planting churches, making disciples. This is now in their conference. They're building a work for God. And then the next photo we have, again, this is conference. These are workers that were announced, I believe, out of the last conference. And then the next photo, still these are workers being prayed for, that Glenn is being prayed for. He's the national leader. That is success going back. Glenn and Kemi Botu are now the leaders in Nigeria, something that came out of a negative circumstance. God has used, they're doing a great work there. There are now 23 churches in Nigeria. Zimbabwe is what we look at next. A worker was sent to Harare, Zimbabwe from Perth, West Australia. We planted Ron and Susie Burrell into Perth, and then over the course of time, out of the Perth church, later on a succeeding pastor sent a worker to Harare, Zimbabwe. And it's kind of interesting that they needed a place to meet. They were struggling. If you read Reinhard Bonnke's biography, and in that he tells about a massive 30,000 seat tent that he had. And so he had this, and at one point in time, part of it got damaged, but a 30,000 seat tent, not a lot of people can use that. And so, but it was so big, he met the worker there, and Reinhard Bonnke wound up donating a large portion of that tent, which was used by the church in Harare. We actually have a video of this. This tent is part of what Reinhard Bonnke donated. And obviously not the whole thing. But here, laboring to build a work, and this is in Harare, Zimbabwe. Next, we have some photos of the early days. And then here, people getting married, which is wonderful in Africa, where many times they will not get married, but preaching on righteousness. Here are workers. There are outreaches that they began to do. Exactly the same pattern that we did here was repeated in Perth, and the worker began to transmit that, and they're doing different language, probably different music, and yet the vision worked in Harare, Zimbabwe, exactly the same. Next photo, or as the next one, a video, I think, is now they began to make disciples. They built a building, and this is the building that they have built. This is their last conference. Darrell Elliott was there preaching, and so God has done a work. They're laboring there, and seeing this is on the other side of the world, Harare, Zimbabwe, in what God is doing there. And finally, as it comes to the right, a little bit more, move camera, here is the pastor, Isaac Madziviri. Next photo, if you go to it, is Isaac and Phyllis Madziviri. They are converts from that church, were discipled in that church, and now they have taken over. They're the national leaders. In Zimbabwe right now, we have 35 churches, plus they have planted 11 other churches in 3 different nations, in Malawi, in Botswana, and Mozambique. And one of the things I want to tell you that is incredible about that is in incredible financial difficulties. The inflation rate, it was at one point in time, one of the workers was telling me when they would go there to fill up the car with fuel, you had to have a briefcase, a suitcase of cash, because it was so worthless. And yet, the vision works. They're believing God, and we thank God. 35 churches in Zimbabwe, 11 churches in 3 different nations. Liberia. We sent a worker to Liberia in 1988. We have the original trumpet report, or one of the original trumpet reports. This is once he got going. This man was actually from outside our fellowship. One of our pastors met him, kind of grafted him in. He started the work in Monrovia, Liberia in 1988. He was not from our fellowship. He actually put things into the church that were not healthy. John and Esther, when he left, John and Esther Gooding went to take it, but there were some very odd things at work. It was explosive, and John and Esther had to leave. They kind of fled for safety's sake and had to leave. So initially, Liberia, it was not a great success, but one of the significant things in God's working, how he arranges things, is some of the original people that got saved in Liberia, they were not Liberian, they were from Sierra Leone. And that will become important when we look at that. The church went through great difficulties, but later on it was rebuilt with workers from Sierra Leone. And now they have made disciples and planted churches. We now have 9 churches in Liberia. Let's talk about Sierra Leone. And this is a wonderful story. As I told you, people from Sierra Leone got saved in the church in Monrovia, Liberia. They were excited. This is often, remember in early lessons I told you, how do we get churches around the world? Often what happens, people get saved. Where they get saved is not where they're from. And a natural part when God works in their heart, they say, we want this in my home country or in my hometown. And so they began to say, we want a church in Sierra Leone. Would you send a worker to Sierra Leone? And so this was they let Pastor Mitchell know this. And so he asked Pastor Harold Warner in Tucson, do you have someone that would be willing to go to Sierra Leone? Harold Warner asked Alvin Smith if he would go preach a crusade in Liberia. And he said, when you go to Liberia, why don't you also take a side trip to Sierra Leone and check it out while you were there? Alvin told me, he said, when he landed in Sierra Leone, as he stepped from the plane onto the ground, God spoke to him and said, you are home. And so in 1989, Alvin and Renee Smith were announced out of Tucson to go to Freetown, Sierra Leone. At that time, so you have to imagine, he is been announced. At that time, he was pastoring the church in Athens, Georgia, and he worked at a school. He said he went into the cafeteria to eat lunch, and he heard some faculty speaking, and one of them had a very distinct accent, and so he went up to him and he said, where are you from? And the man said, I'm from Sierra Leone. And so Alvin said, here's God's interworking. Alvin told him, I am on my way to Sierra Leone to start to plant a new church. And so this man that he met at school invited Alvin and Renee over to his house for dinner and met them, wound up asking his brother in Freetown, this couple are coming to start a church, would you pick them up from the airport and you help them? The man picked them up at the airport, dropped them off where they were going to stay, and he said, I'll be back tomorrow to pick you up because I've gathered some people so you can preach to them. So this is what he did. He said that the teacher in Athens had a sister in Freetown, and in her house, they gathered people. He preached inside the house, opened the window, used the windowsill as a pulpit, and people sat in the yard. It's only the second day. He just arrived yesterday. The next day, he preached to them. And in that service was 2 men. One of them you'll see at conference, and you have seen him, Edward Safa was there, another man that became a pastor, Peter Dorr. Both of them were there, and the man that Alvin met in Athens, Georgia was Peter Dorr's uncle, and then it's at the aunt's house that he got there. We have some photos from the early days from that supernatural beginning. That is, I believe that's Edward Safa doing the baptizing there. The one on the right, and here they're meeting, I think, in a school, if I remember right. But God began to save. God began to do a good work. They built a building. Next photo. This is part of the original building that they built in order to be able to meet in many African nations. There are just not facilities that you can go rent. And so they built a building because God was doing a good work. So our vision is not simply getting people saved, but it is discipleship. And Alvin Smith did a great job, is that as people got saved, he began to train workers in discipleship and ultimately planted a church. That's Alvin Smith, and there is the very first church that was planted out of Freetown, Sierra Leone. That is Edward and Rita Safa, who later on wound up, they're the national leaders now. But that is a milestone because it was the very first church ever planted in Sierra Leone. Many churches wound up being planted in succeeding years, and ultimately they wound up starting a conference, as is our vision. This is now a later conference meeting in the building there, and you can see that God has done a wonderful work. They're currently, because of the need, the work has grown so rapidly, they are currently in a massive building project. I got some photos of the building that they are building. And I can't remember the African style. I can't remember if they said it'll seat 3,000 or something. It's a very, very large building. But they're meeting in the bottom, building on the top. And so God is doing a fantastic thing. They just celebrated their 34th anniversary. That was just weeks ago. And you see Roman Gutierrez there. He is preaching at the 34th anniversary and the wonderful work that God has done. Next photo is Edward and Rita Safa. They'll be here in a few weeks. I believe he's preaching in conference, but they are now the national leaders. He was the one from the first day. He heard Alvin preach, got saved, became a disciple, first workers planted out. As you know, what's very interesting about Edward and Rita is that you know that they had civil war in Sierra Leone. The rebels came, and the rebels were wicked. They would grab people. They have people in the church that their hands or their arms were cut off by the rebels if you didn't support them. But many people were executed. They came one day to the Safa's house, and they took Edward Safa away to execute him. His wife, Rita, came running out after the rebels, weeping, begging them to not kill her husband. She had saved and stashed away the equivalent of $6. And she offered the rebels $6 to not kill her husband, and they released Edward so he could go on and work for God. Gentlemen, always be nice to your wife. Yeah? Good thing she didn't say, take him. But that is a wonderful picture of redemption. Thank God. Sierra Leone is a gem in our fellowship. There are currently 120 churches in Sierra Leone, but they have also planted outside of Sierra Leone. There are 43 churches they planted in 15 different nations: Liberia, Guinea, Senegal, Tanzania, Benin, Togo, Burkina Faso, Gabon, Congo, Brazzaville, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, France, Brussels, Burundi, and Cameroon. We need to thank God for the work that he's done there. Thank God. Oh, thank God for his goodness. Amen. Namibia. Let's talk about Namibia. And Stephen Shirley Anderson originally pioneered the work in Windhoek, Namibia. This is in southwest Africa, borders on South Africa. They were from Tucson. This is them in the early days, did a great work. Steve was in Russia. We've mentioned him in Russia. He was in Ukraine, but went to Windhoek, Namibia, and they were there for 4.5 years. We were in South Africa at the same time. They used to come to conference, did a very, very good job, but ultimately the Andersons, they would not renew his visa, and they had to leave. And so from the church in South London, they sent Peter Ajala. Peter and Emine Ajala took the church, and the moment that they took it over, God just gave them explosive growth. We have a picture of the first baptism. The very first baptism, they baptized 67 people because people were getting saved so rapidly. It began to grow to hundreds of people. Next photo here, these are some of the early days. There's an outreach in the middle. They're meeting in a school. And some of these in the bottom left, that is Peter and Emine Ajala. And God was doing wonderful things. Is there another photo? Let me see the next one. Go to the next photo. No, then go backwards there. Okay, so they could only stay there for 4 months. They didn't have a visa. God was saving people so much, but Namibia, used to be called Southwest Africa, is a German colony. And so the Lutheran Church, which is, its roots are in Germany, was very strong there. Now you had people who were raised in the Lutheran Church. They're not Christian, they just are cultural attenders, but now they got saved. And so waves began to be made. And so the Lutheran Church has pull, they have money, and they began to put pressure on officials. And so they would not renew. In spite of the great work that God was doing, the Ajalas could only stay there for 4 months. And they had to turn it over to Setson and Mary Ndingwapo. These are the workers who took over from them. He is Namibian, Mary is from England, but they took it over. And in the circumstances of need, they were able to take that over. In time, they built a building. Tucson invested, helped them build this building out in the township in an area of poverty that originally started with, huts, tin shacks, and then it becomes a more formal settlement. But they built this building there, and they began to plant churches. And we have some photos from conference. This is now probably would have been the last conference. Mike Webb was preaching at that conference, but they were, these are workers that were announced out and that they were praying for them. I was just there in November 2023. Just have a photo that I took, and this is on a Sunday that we're gathered together there to rally. All the workers came together and did that. And then we have the video from there. And they are saying hello from Namibia. And they are very excitable people. They have a lot of fun in church. Amen. So there are currently 44 churches in Namibia. And they have planted another 4 churches in 3 different nations. They have workers in Angola, in Botswana, and in Germany. Let's talk then, final section, one that I'm familiar with, and that is South Africa. In the history of South Africa, this was the Dutch people who are Afrikaners are people of Dutch descent. They're the ones that were in government. The apartheid system, apartheid means separation, literally by law. The man who was the president at that time was a Dutch Reformed pastor, twisted scripture. He made that this was God's will to separate people, and it was a hard separation by law. In one day, they took everybody in 4 main categories. Whites, you could live wherever you want, but they took blacks, which to them, African is full black. They were forced to live, and it was illegal for them to live anywhere but in an African area. Colored is the third racial classification. Colored means mixed race. They're African and anything. And then Indian. Those are the 4 main ones. Very separated, very racist. It's an amazing history. During the apartheid era, the church in Zwolle, Holland, sent Steve and Janneke Delaporte to pioneer a church in Johannesburg. God bless them. Very difficult. They're trying. You have to understand the restrictions. There's rioting going on at that time, but curfews. It was illegal for people to be out after certain hours, but God bless the Delaportes. They went and they opened the way, tried to build a work during the apartheid era. 1994, apartheid fell. Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and in 1994, a miracle occurred. The end of apartheid. The ANC, the African National Congress, took over. Nelson Mandela became the president. And so what happened now, by law, all of the separation rules, the apartheid rules, went away. Now there was freedom. So we began to send workers. The first worker we sent to South Africa was in Cape Town, and very responsive. And so because of the very good response in Cape Town, this encouraged more church planting. Here's a lesson that we have to learn about our fellowship and from the Bible: responding to open doors. That when God opens a door, sometimes we plant workers by natural means. I have a burden. We plant workers by, I'm from there. But sometimes what happens is there is such a good response. We recognize that. How many of you agree we need to do whatever God is doing? Let's not make him do what we want to do. So when the response was so good, we began to send workers. We began to send more workers, multiple workers in the same conference. We have here a photo. There are the Myolas and the Oversons that were sent. They were sent the same night. Up above, there's Mike and Terry Sawyer, Joe and Heather Rice. They were sent the same night. There in the bottom right, there's Lisa and I and the Van Diermans. We were sent the same night. And so Pastor Mitchell, he is a strategist. Where the fishing is good, let's go there. And so he began to send lots of workers. Not only were we sending from America, the United Kingdom sent 2 workers, Holland sent 3, Australia sent 6 workers there. I want to tell you now, as I said, I'm familiar with South Africa. Let me tell you about our involvement, Lisa and I. We were teenagers in Perth, West Australia. That's where I met Lisa. We were being discipled in Perth, West Australia. At conference, we were watching a conference video of which the footage overseas was almost exclusively the Philippines. It was all about the Philippines, and watching a conference video about the Philippines, God spoke to Lisa and I both and said, I want you to go to Africa. Lisa told me later, God actually told her more clear than me, South Africa. But you gotta admit, we're teenagers, we're not pastors. We knelt at our chair and we said yes to God. We're willing to go to Africa. How is that going to happen? How's a little white boy from Prescott? I have no idea how that's going to happen, but we said yes. And so that would have been in the 1980s. 1995, we took over the church. We had pastored before in Melbourne, area called Footscray. Began to rebuild the work. We arrived in February. It's probably May. We had just finished back-to-back revivals. God was doing great things. And I'm the night after the second revival with Dennis Wright, I'm sitting in my office just rejoicing at what God was doing. And God spoke to me probably the clearest I have ever heard the voice of God, God said, I want you to go to South Africa. So before, when I was a kid, it was Africa in general. I want you to go to, I went immediately in and told Lisa, God just told me we're supposed to go to South Africa, but I have a good wife. She said, okay, I'm willing, but we just got here. And I don't think that would be good for the church. So she said, I think that it's not now, for later. And I said, okay, I agreed with that. And so we just filed that away and got on with building work. 1997, wound up, now the circumstances were right. We did go. And you saw we were announced to go to Johannesburg, South Africa. Johannesburg is massive. I grew up in Prescott. This was 13,000 when we moved here. Perth was larger, but still a nice country town is how it felt. Johannesburg, South Africa was bewildering. Where do you start in a city of, they don't even know how many people there. They claim 5 million. That would be very conservative, hard to count all the people in the shacks, but I went looking for Australia. That was my reference point. Where I had pastored the most was Australia. Found an area that looked kind of similar and began to open in an area called Mondior. And immediately now, I am up against the religious nature of South Africa. Australia, very godless. Very few people went to church. Now South Africa, drug dealers went to church. Everybody goes to church. And so we got people saved. They said the same prayer that I said, but they didn't get it. They had no conviction of sin. It produced no life change. They had no hunger for God. It messed with my head. And I told Lisa, I am not willing to mess with people like this for the rest of my life. If they're not getting converted, that's the basis. We can't do anything for God unless we have conversions. There's a lesson here. God will give supernatural direction to build his work. If you're in obedience to God, he'll guide you. Mike Sawyer knew that I was frustrated. He said, I met a man in an area called Eldorado Park. He was very friendly. Would you like to meet him? This is now a colored or mixed race area. I said, yes. We went to the Parks and Rec where he worked, introduced myself, talked to him just for a few minutes, telling him specifically, why am I here? We're here to get people saved, not like South African Christians, and he looked at me after just a couple of minutes. He looked at me and he said, you need to be here in Eldorado Park. He said, if you will come here, I will help you. And he did. He took me around to high schools and introduced me. It was amazing. Now, what I didn't know about him, I don't know this man. He has introduced me. This is Pastor Mitchell. We would like to do Christian events and concerts and tell people about Jesus. What I don't know about him, he was a communist, atheist, terrorist. We went to the high school that during apartheid, he bombed it. The principal then was his science teacher when he bombed the school years before. He's telling her, we would like to do Christian event. She's looking at him and she asked me, she goes, how do you know this guy? Especially what I didn't know, he was a witch doctor. A Sangoma. I'm talking black magic, wicked. I have no idea. That's why she's asking, how do you know this guy? I'm like, God made me ignorant. And that was good because I probably wouldn't have had anything to do with him. We're driving down the road and a car pulled up. They're talking another language. I said, what do you want? He said, oh, they want the igniters for RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades. You know, in Prescott, we didn't use a lot of RPGs. And I said, what do they want them for? And he said, cash in transit robberies. If you shoot at a cash van, you'll knock it over on its side, and then that gives you time to get the doors open. I said, oh, okay. We had Stacy Dillard coming for a revival, and I thought this was going to be the answer. I got permission to do a great concert, and so our concert got rained out. The outreach, the revival, did not go well. But I had invited Paul the witch doctor, who I didn't know he was a witch doctor. I invited him and his girlfriend over to our house for dinner. And this was amazing. Do you remember the immense racism Still to this day, his friend will rattle off in Afrikaans exactly what he said. He said, "You're not going to believe it. A white guy had us over to his house." And when we're having over for dinner, I said, "Would any of your friends like to come to our house? We're going to show a film." And so he called his friends. We had 28 people in my living room. These are all colored. I want to tell you, my white neighbors freaked out, but that's too bad, because numbers of these people got saved. His good friends, the wife especially, Shauna and Cheryl Stellenberg, got saved in my living room, and Cheryl got the good. She was our only real convert that we had. Now, Stacy, we have the revival. It's not going well. He was supposed to preach the second week in Pretoria for another worker, but that man had white Afrikaners, and they told him, if you have a black man preach, no one will ever come to your church again. So at the last minute, he told Pastor Mitchell, I can't have him. So because we had a free week with Stacy Dillard, I asked Paul, I said, could you get us permission to have a tent set up in a park? And he said, yes, got us permission right in a main park. This is where people came to do drugs, fornicate, drink. We set up right there with no advertising. They finished, we went out for an hour. We passed out, maybe we put up, I think, a dozen posters and handed out maybe 35 to 50 flyers. But the first night in El Dorado Park, as an experiment, we had 65 people come out with no advertising. I think 35 of them got saved. The next night, we had 165 people come out. The next night, 220. We started in early December, and we kept it going. Stacy finished. I preached another week. Mike Sawyer preached another week. We went up until Christmas in this tent. We were supposed to be there for 3 days. We wound up staying there for 2 months. We just never left, and thank God South Africa, they're not big on rules, so we got away with it. I told Pastor Mitchell, I said, if you can get evangelists to come preach, I believe we could leave a solid work. And so in the month of January, we had Marty Carnegie, we had Jesus Becerra, and Rick Martinez. And we had 28 services in 30 days in the month of January. At the end of it, we had a church of 100 people. Just God began. It was a miracle work, yes. What was interesting is, as we're having this, Paul the witch doctor, who I don't know he's a witch doctor, he would come like to 3 out of 5 services, and he'd ask me the same question each night: how did it feel tonight? I said it felt tremendous. Hundreds of people are coming. I'm like, it's fantastic. And he would look puzzled, and he would tell me, tonight you had 3 witch doctors, 4 Satanists. He would tell me the number of witch doctors and Satanists that we had there each night. It never occurred to me to ask how he knew that. But God began to build the work there. At the end of it, we have some photos of a tent. I'm the guy on the left, if you're wondering. There's Stacy Dillard ministering in a tent, and there are no facilities. We had to buy a piece of land. The Prescott Church gave the money so we could buy a piece of land. We bought a tent and set it up. Next photo is the original tent that we had there, and we began to build a work for God. In the bottom right, I think this is a baptism we're about to have, and that was in a tent. The top left, then we built concrete walls or brick walls, but still kept a tent roof, and we were there for a number of years. There's a lesson I want to give you if you want to do the will of God. Some people are afraid. The lesson is God can protect people so they can do His will. We arrive in South Africa. The stories that were in the paper were incomprehensible in their violence. I can't even describe how bad the violence was. Helpful people would say, I would never live there. It's like a war zone. And I told them that's why I came here, so God would kill us. But we had to be there, and immediately helpful people are telling my wife, listen, you go in those areas, I'm telling you, they're going to rape you, kill you, they're going to kill your daughter. But Lisa is praying. She came sight unseen. She had never seen South Africa. She's praying one morning, and God spoke to her, Acts 18:10, for I'm with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you, for I have many people in this city. I want to tell you, we never lived in fear. You have to live with caution, but we never lived in fear in South Africa. Next photo I want to show you. This is a car that I have here, that little Honda Civic. They are on the opposite side of the road, so what you're looking, this side is the driver's side. We're on the freeway coming home from church one night, and a car pulled up next to us. What is the car? 4 feet away, and shot at me at my head, and the bullet bounced off the window. When I got home, you can see just a little mark on the glass there. I don't think that they make Honda Civics bulletproof. But God had told us to be there, and I said, if God wants us here, He's got to keep us safe. And I want to tell you, we went in the most wicked areas of crime and danger, and God helped us. Paul, we have some other photos I want to show you. Move on here. This is outreach. We began to outreach like crazy. There's Lisa witnessing. We had revivals. There's Paul Campbell, Mark Olson, Scott Lamb. Dad, we were outreaching, we're having revivals. God's doing wonderful things. We established prayer meetings. There is in the prayer room, Cheryl, that is the witch doctor's friend that got saved in our living room. Now is a pastor's wife. Sean and Cheryl, they pastor there in South Africa. We are building a work for God. Held the first rally. This is the very first rally gathering workers together. We rented a hall in a school, and Dad preached that, the very first one. When Dad saw the response and what God was doing so quickly, he said, we need to have a conference. Make sure we have a conference by next year. The next year we rented a hall, and this is the one hall we could rent in the whole area, and we had the very first conference in South Africa, and workers came from other places in Africa. There you see the crowds. Next photo. Here are some of the pastors. There's numbers of the missionaries and workers that were there from various places that we were laboring, and that is at the very first conference. A milestone. Next photo is we planted the very first worker out, and that was laying hands on them there. We began the church planting process exactly like we had learned in Prescott and in Perth, and God began doing it. It was so wonderful. We filled up that hall to capacity. There are no facilities, and Dad said, you need to build a building, have it ready by next year. This is in Africa. We had to build a Western-style building that would seat, I think, 1,200 people with a balcony, and it had to be done in 1 year. I almost lost my mind. I was definitely not a Christian for long periods of time in that process, but we got it done, and we got the building built. That is the building that you see there to the left is the balcony, totally Western standard building, and God helped us there. Next photo. Here is in the building, Joe Rice, one of the early workers. Joe's converted, became a pastor in the city of George, is pastoring there. And there's Lisa and I and two of the first workers that we planted out from El Dorado Park. We stayed there for 7.5 years, and then we handed it off to the Polacos, Robert and Jackie Polaco. This is the changeover service in which we handed over to them. They were there for a time, and then they turned the work over to Ron and Kathy Bannett. Ron and Kathy labored in South Africa for 20 years and did a wonderful job there. Next photo, the 20th anniversary. There we are with Ron and Kathy, and we celebrated in 2017 the 20th anniversary, and God began to do great work. We have some photos from a conference that you can see. Next photo. This is the building that we built there, has a balcony. They expanded the mezzanine floor below. And there you see the conference runs 1,400, 1,500. Show the video, and here it has sound. The tone is good, but there we go. And there. So that is the current one. Ron Bennett passed away in 2020 from COVID, and Jonathan and Rachel Heimberg stepped in quickly to take over there, now the national leaders there. But I want to tell you, church planting is what we began in 2001, and that has continued. This is workers planted out in their last conference. Some of these are national pastors that themselves were planted out. Now they are church planting pastors, and they're doing a great work for God, and you see various works there. There are currently 109 churches in South Africa. There are also 24 churches that have been planted in 9 other nations: Botswana, DRC, Ethiopia, Ghana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Madagascar, Malawi, and Mozambique. And I want to tell you, South Africa is a miracle. From the hard racial separation, the absolute miracle that God has done is what you saw in that conference is all 4 races worshiping and building a work for God together. We need to thank God for the work that he's done there. Thank God. I was telling you about how God supernaturally led us through a man that was a witch doctor, and people who have no experience, like, how come you couldn't tell? That man on the left is the witch doctor, and that's why I couldn't tell. He didn't look anything like Tarzan movies, and didn't have a bone through his nose. But there on the right is his friend. Sean and Cheryl came and were saved in our house. He brought them out, and I was describing to you how he would, night after night, tell me the number of witch doctors and Satanists that were there at the tent campaign, and I was telling you about God's protection. Paul Brander finally, after being open more than a year, Glenn Cluck revival was coming up. We took him out to dinner, witnessed to him, and he finally confessed that he was a witch doctor. And so when I got him home, I said, you have to make a choice. Paul, you're tormented, you don't sleep, and you're going to burn in hell. And we got home, and he pulled out all of his witchcraft paraphernalia, and I said, you have to choose. And there at his house, we pushed all of that aside. I led him in a sinner's prayer. He got saved, and I cast demons out of that man. And he lived for God for a time, had to ask him to leave. He wouldn't get married to his girlfriend, but now this is when he came back, was in the church. And when he came back, I was telling you about God's protection. The first time I saw him when he came back, he quoted to me Isaiah 54:17. He said, no weapon formed against you shall prosper. And I said, I know that, Paul. And he said, no, you don't understand. He said, we were trying to curse you. And he said, I would get together with other of the main witch doctors and Satanists in the area. We were trying to curse you one night, and we were through incantation. We were trying to get into your house. One of the other witch doctors had never been to my house, but described it. And he said, as we were trying to get into your house to curse you, he said there were men standing all around your house with arms length, and they would not let us in. He said, no weapon formed against you shall prosper. And that is the work that God did of protection for us. We thank God for that. Amen. Amen. You pray for him. His name is Paul Brander. He wound up moving away, lives in a smaller town, but he tells Sean, he says, we need a Potter's House church there in Springbok is where he lives now. He's a teacher at a university. And he says, if you'll send a work there to the Potter's House here, he says, I will help them. And I believe that he will. He was very, very helpful. He is why we have a work in El Dorado Park. Who could think up such a story? If you were wanting to plant a church, would you dream up, I know, I'll have a witch doctor help them. But that is how smart and powerful that God is. Thank God.